Tonight, we are going to take a slow journey back to the land of ancient Egypt, a place of great pyramids, golden tombs, and mysterious gods. But rather than speak only of kings and battles, tonight we will drift into the forgotten corners of daily life. There, among the temples and the riverbanks of the Nile, we will discover some of the strangest jobs that ordinary Egyptians once held. These are not the roles we learn about in school. They are odd, unusual, and at times even unsettling. Yet for the people of the time, they were ordinary, respectable, and sometimes sacred. From mourners who were paid to cry at funerals, to men who risked their lives feeding sacred crocodiles, the Egyptians found meaning in work that to us seems almost unimaginable. By walking quietly through these lives, we glimpse a world both strange and deeply human. Before we begin, I invite you to take a moment to settle in. Make yourself comfortable, let the outside world drift away, and prepare to be carried into the past. If you enjoy this calm journey through history, I would love for you to subscribe to the channel so you can join me again on another night. It also helps others who have trouble falling asleep find this soothing corner of the internet. And if you feel like sharing, leave a comment below and let me know what moments in history you would like me to explore next, and when you usually listen, whether late at night, during restless evenings, or even in the quiet of the afternoon. Now, let us close our eyes and picture the Nile flowing slowly through a desert land. The stars rise above the pyramids, and the flicker of oil lamps dances across the stone walls of a temple. In this quiet, we will meet the forgotten workers whose strange professions filled the rhythms of Egyptian life. Let the story unfold gently, and if sleep finds you along the way, know that the journey will still be here when you return. In the heart of ancient Egypt, death was not seen as an ending, but as a crossing, a passage from this life into another eternal one. For such an important transition, the Egyptians believed that every detail mattered. When a person died, their family and community would gather to mourn, but mourning was not left to chance or to the emotions of those closest to the dead. It was a ritual, and like many rituals in Egypt, it required specialists. Thus came to exist one of the strangest professions of the ancient world, the professional mourner. These were usually women, chosen not for their closeness to the deceased, but for their ability to perform grief with intensity and passion. When someone of status died, mourners would be hired to cry, wail, and tear at their clothing in displays of despair. Their role was not to express their own sadness, but to embody grief on behalf of the community. To Egyptians, loud weeping did more than comfort the living. It called the attention of the gods, showing that the dead were loved and valued. In the silence of death, noise became a bridge between worlds. The job was not simple. A mourner needed endurance, for funerals could stretch across days. They learned how to cry with voices that carried, how to smear dust upon their faces, how to beat their chests until the sound echoed through the streets. They wept not gently but fiercely, filling the air with a sense of urgency, as though the dead must not be allowed to leave without acknowledgement. In tomb paintings and carvings, these women are shown kneeling at the bier of the deceased, arms raised high, hair loose, mouths open wide in eternal cries. It was a profession carved into stone, meant to last as long as the monuments themselves. Behind this strange custom lay powerful beliefs. Egyptians thought that the soul of the deceased needed help in reaching the afterlife. A proper burial required not only the physical preparation of the body, but also the emotional outpouring of grief, a sign to the gods that this person mattered. To die without mourners was to risk being forgotten, lost in the endless sands. The professional mourners filled that need, standing in when families could not muster enough voices, or when the importance of the deceased demanded a greater chorus. The mourners often worked in pairs, sometimes representing the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, divine sisters who were said to have wept for Osiris when he was slain by his brother Set. In playing these roles, the women were not only acting, but becoming vessels of sacred grief, connecting myth with reality. For a time, they were more than mortal women. They embodied the eternal mourning of the gods themselves, ensuring that the journey of the soul mirrored the journey of the divine. The life of a professional mourner was not glamorous. Though their presence was needed, they occupied a strange space in society. They were both respected for their role and looked down upon, for their work was tied to death and ritual impurity. Some may have lived in poverty, taking on this task for modest pay or offerings of food. Yet they traveled from one ceremony to another, their voices shaping the final memory of the dead. For the families who paid them, the mourners became part of the fabric of loss, their cries woven into the memory of funerals. Imagine for a moment the sound of such a procession. The sun burns hot on the sand, the Nile shimmers in the distance, and the body of the deceased is carried through the streets. Around them, relatives follow in silence, but above that silence rises the piercing cries of women hired for this very moment. Their voices rise and fall, echoing against the mud brick walls. Some clutch at their hair, others beat their chests. Dust rises as feet stamp the ground in rhythm with their grief. To an outsider, it might seem overwhelming, even theatrical, but to an Egyptian, it was sacred. The louder the lament, the more honored the dead. This practice, strange as it might seem, endured for centuries. It was recorded by travelers, painted in tombs, and described in inscriptions. Even when dynasties fell and new rulers rose, the mourners kept their place in the rituals of death. Their cries remained as essential as the priests who recited spells, as the embalmers who prepared the body, and as the offerings of bread and beer placed in the tomb. Death was never silent in Egypt. It was a chorus, a performance of love and duty, and the mourners were its most vivid voices. When we think about work today, we imagine tasks of building, farming, or trade. But in Egypt, work extended into the realm of the spirit. To weep, to wail, to embody grief became a profession, a way of life. For these women, sorrow was not a fleeting emotion, but a practiced skill, something learned and honed. It was perhaps exhausting, perhaps numbing, but always necessary. And though their names are lost to us, their presence remains, whispered through the art and echoes of funerary rituals. As the funeral procession wound its way toward the tomb, the mourners walked with it. They did not stop until the final rites were complete, until the body was laid to rest and the tomb sealed. Only then, when the soul was thought to be safely on its journey, would their cries fade into silence. The desert would reclaim its stillness, and life would continue along the Nile. Yet for a moment, in the space between life and death, their strange profession carried great weight. Their cries gave voice to what all feared, the loss of life and the hope of eternity. And so, in the long catalogue of Egyptian jobs, the professional mourner holds a place both unsettling and profoundly human, a reminder that even in antiquity, grief itself could be someone's work. Among the many unusual roles that existed in ancient Egypt, there was one that sounds almost whimsical at first, but carried with it a deep seriousness and even danger. This was the Pharaoh's Sniffer, a person whose duty was to smell, taste, and sometimes even test the food, drink, and perfumes before they reached the Pharaoh. The job was part servant, part protector, and part ritual guardian. For to serve the Pharaoh was not merely to serve a man, but to serve the living embodiment of a god on earth. The Egyptians believed their ruler was chosen by the gods, a link between the divine and the mortal world. To keep him safe was to keep the entire kingdom safe. Because of this, the Pharaoh's table was a place of both luxury and risk. Food was brought in from across the empire, dates from oases, fish from the Nile, honey from beekeepers, bread baked from freshly milled grain. With so many sources, there was always the possibility of taint, spoilage, or, in the darker corners of politics, deliberate poison. Here, the sniffer became essential. Before the pharaoh ate or drank, before he bathed in oils or perfumes, someone had to test them. Imagine the scene of a great banquet hall, with carved columns rising to painted ceilings. Musicians play softly, dancers move gracefully, and servants carry in platters of roasted duck, baskets of figs, and jars of sweet beer. But before these delicacies reach the Pharaoh, a sniffer steps forward. He leans over the platter, inhales deeply, and perhaps takes a cautious bite. He raises the jar of beer to his lips and sips, swallowing just enough to prove it safe. If he falters, if the food is tainted, his life is the one at risk, not the ruler's. It was a profession that demanded not only a sharp nose and steady nerves, but also a willingness to place one's life in danger for duty. The role extended beyond food. Fragrance was vital in Egyptian culture, not only for pleasure but for ritual. Perfumes of myrrh, frankincense, lotus, and cinnamon were believed to purify the body and please the gods. The pharaoh was expected to smell divine, his presence filling rooms with scents of heaven. But these perfumes were costly imports, and blending them was a delicate art. Some mixtures could spoil, and others could be harsh. The pharaoh's sniffer was tasked with ensuring every fragrance was worthy of a god-king, breathing in deeply to judge whether the balance was perfect or flawed. This job, though strange to us, carried enormous trust. To place one's safety in another's senses required loyalty beyond measure. The pharaoh's sniffer was always close by, present at meals, at ceremonies, and sometimes even at the pharaoh's bath, where oils and unguents were applied to his skin. Their life was tethered to the ruler's body, a shadow that ensured every detail of taste and smell met the highest standards. And because Egyptians valued purity, this was not simply about danger, it was also about symbolism. The pharaoh had to embody perfection, and his food and scent were part of that perfection. One can imagine the quiet tension of such a role. At times, perhaps the sniffer's senses were overwhelmed by constant testing. Perhaps meals that should have been a joy became repetitive rituals of cautious inhalation, tiny tastes, and anxious waiting. To others, a feast meant abundance, but to the sniffer, it meant responsibility. Each bite carried the possibility of harm, each sip the weight of trust. In this way, what seems like a light duty was in truth a heavy burden. The presence of a sniffer also reflected the fears of the court. Power in Egypt, as in all great civilizations, brought enemies. There were rival factions, jealous officials, and perhaps those who dreamed of replacing the pharaoh. Poison was one of the oldest tools of intrigue. A pinch of a toxic herb, a drop of venom, or spoiled meat could end a reign before its time. The pharaoh's sniffer stood as a barrier against these silent threats, their senses serving as shields where no weapon could protect. They are part of the invisible guard, defenders not with spears, but with their noses and tongues. But even beyond danger, the sniffer had a role in pleasure. Egyptian banquets were lavish, and scents filled the air as much as music. Guests would arrive wearing cones of perfumed wax upon their heads, which slowly melted, releasing fragrance through the night. For the pharaoh, these scents had to be perfect, and so the sniffer judged them. He ensured the honeyed sweetness of lotus oil or the spicy richness of cinnamon was balanced and pleasing. It was as much about artistry as safety, a blending of protection and refinement. The pharaoh's sniffer was, in many ways, invisible to history. We do not know their names, for they were not recorded in grand inscriptions or celebrated in tombs. Yet their presence is hinted at in descriptions of court life and in the sheer logic of palace ritual. A ruler so elevated, so essential to the stability of Egypt, could not have been left unguarded at the table. And so, even if unnamed, the sniffer must have walked the halls of palaces, breathed in the air of temples, and tested the food that sustained a god on earth. To us, it may seem strange to dedicate a life to smelling and tasting, always for another and never for oneself. Yet in the tapestry of Egyptian society, every thread had its place. Just as some tilled the fields, some carved stone, and some sang hymns to the gods, Others protected the Pharaoh through senses most take for granted. The nose that sniffed, the tongue that tasted, became tools of power as surely as chariots and swords. As the Pharaoh reclined, confident in the safety of his feast, it was the unseen Sniffer who bore the risk, who ensured the divine ruler could eat and breathe in peace. And so this odd profession, half guardian and half servant, reminds us that in Egypt, even the smallest of senses, taste and smell, were elevated into matters of life and death. It was a job that demanded courage disguised as routine, and though history has left it in shadows, it was vital to the survival of kings and, through them, to the endurance of a civilization. In the long story of ancient Egypt, there is one group of workers who stand out not for their muscles or their craft with tools, but for their mastery of the written word. These were the scribes, men whose hands held reed pens instead of plows, whose days were spent bending over sheets of papyrus, recording the lifeblood of an empire. To be a scribe was to belong to a small and privileged class, yet the work itself, when looked at closely, was far stranger and heavier than we might first imagine. Their job was endless, repetitive, and at times deeply unusual, for they were not only record keepers, but writers of spells, curses, and magical words believed to shape reality itself. The Egyptians valued writing as a sacred gift, said to have been bestowed by the god Thoth, the deity of wisdom and language. Hieroglyphs were not mere symbols, but carriers of divine power. Every mark made by a scribe was thought to connect the earthly with the eternal. A wrong stroke could change meaning, shift a prayer, or even offend a god. With such responsibility, scribes were both honored and burdened. They trained for years to memorize signs, to master calligraphy, and to understand the many layers of Egyptian writing, from formal hieroglyphs carved into stone to the faster, flowing scripts used on papyrus. But the daily life of a scribe was far from glamorous. Imagine sitting in the dry heat of the Nile Valley, hunched for hours over a low wooden desk. Sheets of papyrus stretched out, ink made from soot and gum ready in small pallets. The reed brush, sharpened and dipped, scratched across the surface, leaving line after line of symbols. They copied lists of taxes, inventories of grain, records of cattle, names of workers, and commands from officials. The work was meticulous and often monotonous. One mistake could spoil a document, forcing the scribe to begin again. The eyes grew tired, the back stiff, the hands cramped. Day after day, the same motions repeated until writing itself became a rhythm as steady as the Nile's flow. Yet there was another side to their work, one that gave it a strange and almost mystical quality. Scribes were not only bureaucrats. They were also the keepers of magic. In tombs and temples, they inscribed words meant to guide the dead through the afterlife, prayers to gods, and curses to ward off thieves. A scribe might spend a morning recording the weight of barley, and an afternoon writing a curse to frighten anyone who disturbed a grave. In this way, the pen carried power beyond numbers. It was a tool of administration and of enchantment. Think for a moment of the Book of the Dead, that collection of spells placed in tombs to help the soul navigate the perils of the afterlife. Every copy had to be carefully written by hand. Line after line of spells were traced, each symbol exact, each image of gods and demons drawn with precision. To fall asleep while copying such texts would not only risk error, but risk offense to the spirits themselves. The scribe's concentration had to be steady, even as the hours dragged on and the ink dried beneath the sun. In the quiet of his work, the scribe was shaping eternity, ensuring that the dead could pass safely into paradise. The burden of this role was heavy, for mistakes were not only earthly but cosmic. An incorrect hieroglyph in a spell could mean the difference between a soul finding peace or becoming lost in darkness. Imagine the pressure of such responsibility resting upon every stroke of the brush. The work may have been tedious, but it was also filled with fear and awe. To write was to carry a weight far greater than one's own life. Scribes also served as the voice of power. Pharaohs and officials relied on them to make their commands permanent, their laws enduring. A scribe's brush could fix an order into eternity, could carve a king's will into the memory of stone. Yet this closeness to power was not always safe. A scribe who wrote for one ruler might find himself forced to erase the name of another, to strike out a memory as though it had never existed. To chisel away the name of a disgraced king was to kill him a second time, erasing him from history. This, too, was the work of scribes, their brushes carrying not only life, but also destruction. To outsiders, the job may have looked peaceful, even easy compared to the heavy labor of farmers and builders. But in truth, it demanded a mind always alert, a body able to endure long hours of stillness, and a spirit able to balance the mundane with the mystical. They worked in silence, yet their silence echoed through eternity. Their words, copied and recopied, have survived for thousands of years. When we read an Egyptian spell or gaze at a painted scroll in a museum, we are seeing the hand of one such weary scribe, his strange labor preserved across the ages. It is worth remembering that not all scribes worked in grand temples or palaces. Many were stationed in dusty offices, recording the movements of grain from one storehouse to another, or walking the edges of fields to mark down harvests. They carried their writing boards into villages, listening to disputes, documenting debts, and keeping track of labor for building projects. They were everywhere, weaving the fabric of Egypt's vast administration. Their work may not have been glamorous, but without them the kingdom could not have functioned. Every loaf of bread baked for a worker, every stone cut for a pyramid, every soldier sent to guard the borders, each was first written down by a scribe. And so the life of a scribe, though privileged in status, was one of endless labor. They were the quiet engines of the state, their voices muted, but their words eternal. Theirs was a strange job, not because it was unusual, but because it combined drudgery with divinity, routine with magic. They lived in the tension between earthly bureaucracy and cosmic responsibility, between ink-stained fingers and the belief that their symbols could shape the destiny of souls. When night fell and the scribe put away his tools, he might leave behind a day filled with endless copying. But the marks he made would remain, etched into papyrus or stone, carrying on long after his own life ended. In this way, a scribe's labor was never truly finished. Each word he wrote was a step in a journey that stretched across centuries, and each page a fragment of eternity. Among the most curious jobs in ancient Egypt was that of the keeper of sacred animals. To the modern mind, the idea of someone tending animals does not sound unusual. Farmers have done so for thousands of years. Yet in Egypt, certain animals were not simply beasts of burden or sources of food. They were living symbols of gods, worshipped as holy beings and treated with reverence. To care for them was not farm work, but priestly duty, a mixture of devotion, ritual, and daily labor that placed the keeper in a world balanced between the ordinary and the divine. The Egyptians lived close to animals, and they saw in them the qualities of the gods. The falcon soared like Horus, the great sky god. The ibis walked gracefully as Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Cats, sleek and protective, were linked to Bastet, the goddess of home and fertility. Bulls, strong and majestic, were joined to Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis. Even crocodiles, feared by all along the Nile, were honored as the living forms of Sobek, a god of strength and danger. These animals were not symbols in the abstract. They were chosen, kept, and honored as living vessels of the divine. The keeper of sacred animals, then, had an unusual duty. It was his or her task to ensure that the chosen animals lived in comfort and health. Cats had to be fed, birds given perches, bulls led to pastures, crocodiles guarded and offered food. Their well-being was not merely practical, it was religious. A hungry sacred bull was not simply a neglected animal, but a god left wanting. A sick falcon was not just an ill bird, but a disruption in the order of heaven. The keeper carried this responsibility each day, tending creatures whose care was believed to keep harmony between gods and men. Imagine, for instance, the life of a man charged with caring for the Apis bull. In Memphis, the Apis bull was revered as one of the most important sacred beings in all of Egypt. It had to be chosen with care, marked by certain sacred patterns upon its hide. Once chosen, it was housed in great splendor, stabled in a temple, offered fine food, and paraded before crowds who came to bow before it. The keeper's role was to feed the bull, groom it, watch over its health, and ensure that its every need was met. Day after day, this man lived in the shadow of a divine beast, his hands touching what others only dared approach in reverence. When the bull died, it was mummified with honors equal to kings, and the keeper became part of the ceremonies of death and renewal. Other keepers had less grand but equally strange tasks. The cult of Bastet in Bubastis maintained great numbers of cats, which were fed, cared for, and eventually mummified to be offered in temples. The keeper's day might involve feeding bowls of fish, cleaning temple courtyards where cats wandered freely, or soothing the creatures when they hissed and fought. In a land where cats were sacred, to harm one was a crime punishable by death, and so the keeper's job carried enormous weight. A careless accident, a moment of neglect, could be seen as a sacrilege against the goddess herself. There were also those who tended crocodiles, animals that most would flee from in terror. In certain temples, crocodiles were raised in pools and honored as Sobek incarnate. The keeper of such beasts had to enter those spaces, carrying food, lowering offerings of bread, meat, and sometimes even honeyed cakes into the water. To feed a crocodile was to place one's arm dangerously close to snapping jaws, yet it was done with ritual care, for the god had to be appeased. The keeper's heart may have beat quickly in fear, but his hands moved with steadiness born of devotion. Few jobs combined danger and sanctity in such a way. The ibis sacred to Thoth also required attention. Flocks of these birds were kept near temples, their long curved beaks seen as reflections of divine wisdom. Keepers provided food, ensured nesting places, and gathered the bodies of those that died naturally, which were embalmed and offered as votive gifts. Thousands upon thousands of ibis mummies have been found in catacombs, each one the result of a keeper's careful duty. It is strange to imagine a life spent among birds, feeding them by day and gathering them in death, all for the sake of a god's favor. The role of keeper of sacred animals was not only about feeding and tending, it required knowledge of ritual. The animals had to be presented in ceremonies, washed, anointed, and decorated. The bull might be adorned with garlands, cats with jewelry, falcons with small hoods or perches. At festivals, the keeper prepared the animals to be seen by crowds, ensuring they appeared healthy and strong. Each action was symbolic, a reflection of cosmic order. To neglect appearance was to neglect the god. One can imagine the rhythm of such a life. The day began with feeding, the soft sounds of animals stirring in temple courtyards. The keeper moved quietly among them, pouring grain, carrying fish, lowering meat into pools. He or she would check the animal's health, watching for signs of illness or weakness, offering prayers as tasks were done. When festivals approached, the work grew more intense. The animals were cleaned, perfumed, and prepared, the temple filled with both the noise of creatures and the chanting of priests. Through it all, the keeper remained a servant not only to the animals, but to the gods they represented. It was a strange job, a blend of priesthood and caretaking, humble in labor but exalted in meaning. For while farmers fed men, keepers fed gods. Their work did not end when an animal died. Many of the sacred creatures were mummified, their bodies wrapped in linen, placed in decorated coffins, and buried with offerings. The keeper often oversaw this process, ensuring the body was prepared with respect. Thus, even in death, the animals remained divine, and the keeper's role continued. To us, the life of a keeper of sacred animals may seem unusual, even unbelievable. But to the Egyptians, it was a calling filled with honor. They saw no strangeness in feeding cats in a temple, or guiding a bull through city streets in a parade of devotion. To them, animals were bridges between the human and the divine, and those who cared for them were essential guardians of that sacred link. Their days were filled with tasks both ordinary and extraordinary, simple in motion, yet cosmic in meaning. And though their names are lost, their work survives in the endless rows of mummified animals, in the paintings of bulls and falcons, and in the quiet memory of a civilization that saw the divine not only in the sky, but also in the fur feather and scales of the living world around them. When we think of tombs in ancient Egypt, the mind often drifts to golden treasures, painted walls, and carefully wrapped mummies resting in silence. Yet behind the stillness of these burial chambers lay another profession, one that combined writing, fear, and mystery. This was the work of the tomb cursors, people tasked with crafting words of warning, words of magic, words meant to terrify anyone who dared disturb the eternal rest of the dead. It was a job that lived on the edge between ritual and menace, a strange labor devoted to protecting the tomb from both human thieves and unseen forces. Egyptians held a profound belief in the afterlife. To them, a tomb was not merely a grave, but a house for eternity. Inside were not only the body, but also the objects needed for a soul's journey: food, furniture, amulets, clothing, and treasures. To lose these to robbers was not only a theft of wealth, but a theft of eternity itself. Without their possessions and offerings, the dead might suffer hunger or weakness in the next world. Thus, curses became a shield, etched in words upon stone, meant to frighten away the greedy and the careless. The tomb cursors were scribes of a darker kind. Their brushes and chisels did not only record prayers to guide the soul, but also threats designed to guard it. They wrote lines that warned of divine punishment, of broken bones, of blindness, of torment at the hands of gods. Some curses promised that thieves would be devoured by crocodiles, others that serpents would coil around them in the night, or that jackals would dig up their bodies. The words were vivid, painted or carved into doorways, walls, and even the very sarcophagus of the dead. These were not idle phrases. To Egyptians, words held power. To write them was to call them into being. One might imagine a tomb cursor at work, deep in a chamber lit by flickering oil lamps. Around him, the air is cool, heavy with the scent of limestone and fresh paint. On the wall before him is a blank space, ready to receive the curse. With careful strokes, he begins, his reed brush dipped in ink, his hand steady. The words flow, calling on the gods to smite, to blind, to punish. Each stroke is more than writing, it is conjuring. The silence of the tomb is filled with unseen weight, as though the walls themselves are listening. When he finishes, the curse stands ready, guarding the chamber long after his own life is forgotten. The job was strange, because it mixed the sacred with the sinister. Scribes usually wrote records or prayers, words meant to sustain or uplift. The tomb cursor, by contrast, wrote to frighten, to repel, to curse. It required a kind of darkness of imagination, the ability to envision punishment and horror, and set it down in precise form. Yet in Egypt, this darkness was not evil. It was protective, a service to the dead, an act of loyalty to families who feared for the safety of their loved ones in eternity. To curse a thief was not cruelty, but justice, a way of ensuring that the tomb remained undisturbed. Some of these curses were direct, naming anyone who might disturb the tomb as the target. Others were more subtle, invoking gods and spirits to act as guardians. One inscription might read of 1,000 crocodiles in the river, ready to strike. Another of the serpent that will coil and strike the intruder. The words were not empty. Thieves, upon reading them, may have felt a chill, a fear that the unseen would follow them home. In a world where the gods were ever present, to invite their wrath was no small matter. The power of belief was itself a weapon, and the tomb curser wielded it skillfully. We might wonder who these people were, and whether they themselves feared the words they wrote. Did the tomb curser believe in the curses he inscribed? Or did he see them as tools, as duties assigned by priests and families? Perhaps it was both. In a land where words shaped reality, even the writer could not be entirely free of their weight. Each time he carved a threat of blindness or death, perhaps a small part of him wondered if he too might one day fall under the shadow of the words. Yet he continued, for this was his work, his strange service to the dead. The presence of curses did not always deter robbers. Many tombs were plundered despite them, treasures stripped away, mummies disturbed. But still the curses were written, because their power was not only in fear, but in ritual. They signaled that the dead were protected, that the tomb was not abandoned. They connected the chamber to the eternal, surrounding the body with words as strong as stone. Even when thieves ignored them, the curses remained, preserved on the walls, whispering through centuries to anyone who looked upon them. The tomb cursors also played a role in creating traps, whether real or imagined. Some inscriptions hinted at poison or mechanical dangers, though most of these were symbolic rather than actual. Still, the idea of a cursed tomb has haunted the imagination ever since. When modern archaeologists uncovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 and several members of the team died in the years that followed, whispers of an ancient curse filled newspapers around the world. Though no such curse was found inscribed in the boy king's tomb, the legend itself reveals how deeply the idea of Egyptian curses lingers in human memory. It was the legacy of those long-ago tomb cursors, whose words were sharp enough to echo even into modern times. For the people of Egypt, the work of these scribes was not sinister entertainment, but necessary duty. They believed the afterlife was fragile, always under threat from chaos, from thieves, from neglect. The curse stood as a wall of words, a barrier woven of ink and stone. To be a tomb curser was to live with death, to spend one's days in the half-light of burial chambers, writing not for the living, but for the silence of eternity. It was a strange, solemn labor, one that left no names behind, but countless warnings, still legible thousands of years later. And so the tomb cursors, forgotten in life, became eternal in their work. Their curses remain etched on walls, carved into stone, painted on coffins. They remind us that in Egypt, even words were weapons, even scribes could become guardians, and even the act of writing could stand as a shield against time, theft, and the restless hand of mortality. Among the strangest and perhaps least enviable professions in ancient Egypt was that of the lice collector. To us, lice are pests, tiny parasites that cause itching and discomfort. In the world of the Egyptians, they were no less unpleasant, but the fight against them took on a special meaning, especially in the religious sphere. Priests who served the gods had to be clean, pure, and free of impurities. This did not only mean spiritual purity through prayers and rituals. It meant physical cleanliness down to the very smallest detail, including the removal of lice from the body. And so a job was born, one that demanded patience, sharp eyes, and an unusual intimacy with another person's body. The priests of Egypt were required to maintain strict cleanliness. Unlike the general population, they shaved their heads, their beards, even their entire bodies, removing every hair that might harbor dirt or insects. They bathed several times a day, washed in sacred pools, and wore fresh linen clothing. The gods, it was believed, demanded purity, and nothing impure was allowed to approach the inner sanctuaries of temples. Yet hair grows back, and even the most careful washing could not entirely prevent lice from appearing. Thus there were attendants whose task was to comb through hair, to pluck away lice, and to ensure that the priests remained spotless. The lice collector worked with quiet precision, bending close, fingers moving patiently. removing what others might prefer not to see. It may seem a small thing, but to the Egyptians it was vital. To enter the presence of a god with lice in one's hair would have been a violation, an insult. Purity was not symbolic alone. It was lived in the body. The lice collector's job ensured that priests could fulfill their duties without shame or impurity. In a sense, the work was invisible. If done well, it left no trace. If done poorly, it risked the wrath of the gods. Such was the weight that rested on such a strange profession. We might imagine the daily rhythm of this task. A priest, before beginning his duties, sits quietly on a stool in the shade of a temple courtyard. His head is freshly shaved, but the scalp must be examined carefully. The lice collector leans close, searching the skin, fingers parting what little stubble remains, eyes scanning for movement. When lice or eggs are found, they are plucked away, sometimes crushed between fingernails, sometimes dropped into small jars. It is tedious work, almost endless, for lice return quickly, and the task must be repeated again and again. Yet it was done with solemnity, for it was not simply grooming, but preparation for communion with the divine. Beyond priests, lice collectors may also have served the wealthy, those who valued cleanliness and appearance. In the households of nobles, where servants bathed their masters, dressed them, and scented them with perfumes, the lice collector played a quiet part. To be free of parasites was a mark of status, a sign of wealth and care. Thus, while the poor scratched and endured, the rich paid others to ensure they remained untroubled. In this way, the lice collector was both a humble servant and a guardian of dignity. The role was not without discomfort. To work so closely with lice was to handle what others despised. The collector might face disdain, for who would willingly spend their days picking insects from the skin of others? Yet, at the same time, the job carried necessity. Without them, priests risked impurity, nobles risked embarrassment, and rituals risked being defiled. The lice collector's strange labor supported the grand machinery of Egyptian religion and society, though no monument bears their name. Hygiene in Egypt was taken seriously. The hot climate, the dust of the desert, and the closeness of life along the Nile made cleanliness both practical and sacred. Egyptians bathed often, used oils to keep their skin supple, and scented themselves with perfumes. They shaved heads not only for religious purity, but also for comfort in the heat. Wigs were worn for style and ceremony, set atop clean-shaven scalps. Yet beneath this elegance lurked the constant battle with lice. And so the collector's work was woven into daily life, hidden beneath the surface of polished appearances. It is fascinating to consider how something so small could shape an entire role in society. Lice are nearly invisible to the eye, yet they created a profession, demanded time, and influenced the appearance of priests and nobles alike. The lice collector reminds us that history is not only built on grand structures and powerful rulers, but also on the quiet, mundane battles of daily life. To fight against an insect became, in its way, an act of devotion, a contribution to the vast order of Egyptian religion. We can picture the silence of such work. The temple around them hums with chants. Priests prepare incense, scribes record offerings. And in a quiet corner, someone bends over the scalp of another, eyes narrowed in concentration, fingers moving delicately. It is a scene of intimacy and patience, unnoticed by most, yet essential for the rituals that will soon follow. The gods, it was believed, required nothing less than perfection, and the lice collector played a hidden role in achieving that perfection. Though their names are lost and their lives unrecorded, the memory of their work lingers in the descriptions of priestly purity. They were workers in the shadows, ensuring that those who stood in the light of the gods could do so without blemish. Strange though their task may seem to us, it was part of the fabric of Egyptian life, a reminder that even the smallest details mattered in a world where the divine touched every aspect of existence. And so, among the strangest jobs of ancient Egypt, the Lice Collector holds a quiet place. Not glorious, not celebrated, but deeply human. A profession born of necessity, performed with patience, and forgotten in the grand sweep of time. Yet in their quiet way, they served both gods and men, ensuring that the sacred and the ordinary remained in harmony, one louse at a time. Along the banks of the Nile, where the water shimmered in the sunlight and reeds swayed in the breeze, lived creatures that inspired both fear and reverence, the crocodiles. Their armored bodies slipped silently through the river, their eyes just above the surface, their jaws ready to snap shut with terrifying force. For the ordinary farmer or fisherman, crocodiles were a constant danger, capable of pulling a man under in moments. But in certain parts of Egypt, they were more than just predators. They were sacred beings, embodiments of the god Sobek, a deity of strength, fertility, and the unpredictable power of the Nile, and because they were sacred, they had to be cared for. Thus, there existed the unusual profession of the crocodile feeder. The crocodile feeder's work was not like that of the average animal keeper. To feed a cat or a bull was one thing, but to feed a crocodile required courage, caution, and devotion. These animals were worshipped in temples, kept in pools or lakes near shrines dedicated to Sobek. Pilgrims brought offerings, believing the sacred crocodile brought blessings, fertility, or protection. The feeder's task was to make sure the animal was cared for, to lower food into its jaws, and to maintain the reverence due to a living god. It was dangerous work, for the line between sacred and deadly was always thin when dealing with a crocodile. Imagine a temple courtyard in the Pharaoh, where the cult of Sobek was especially strong. A pool of water lies at the center, surrounded by walls of stone. Within the pool, the glimmer of scales breaks the surface. The feeder approaches, carrying a basket of fish, bread, and sometimes even meat wrapped in honey. Pilgrims gather at the edge, whispering prayers, their eyes fixed on the sacred beast. The feeder kneels, holding out food on a wooden paddle or lowering it with ropes. With a sudden movement, the crocodile lunges, jaws clamping down with a sound that echoes across the courtyard. The pilgrims gasp, both afraid and awed. The feeder remains calm, steady, repeating the act until the crocodile is satisfied. For him, this is daily labor, both sacred and perilous. The job was not without ritual. Feeding the crocodile was more than nourishment. It was an offering. The food symbolized the devotion of the people, given through the hands of the feeder. Every act had to be done with care, for the crocodile represented Sobek himself. To neglect the animal, to let it go hungry, was to dishonor the god. Thus, the feeder bore the responsibility of ensuring divine satisfaction. His work was both practical and holy, a strange mixture of zookeeper and priest. One can imagine the inner thoughts of such a person. Perhaps he felt pride, for few could claim to serve a living God so closely. Perhaps he felt fear, knowing that one wrong step, one careless movement, could end his life. Crocodiles are not tame, no matter how often they are fed. They remain wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. The feeder's courage lay not in fighting them, but in approaching them day after day, bringing food and trusting ritual to protect him from harm. At times, the crocodiles grew famous. Some temples had multiple crocodiles, each treated with reverence, adorned with jewelry, and shown to visitors. Straps of gold or semi-precious stones were fastened around their bodies, and priests declared them sacred. When they died, they were mummified, wrapped in linen, and buried in sacred catacombs. Thousands of crocodile mummies have been discovered, each one prepared with care. The feeder's role extended even into death, for he may have helped present the body, oversee its preparation, and ensure that Sobek's earthly vessel was honored properly. It is strange to imagine how normal this might have seemed to an Egyptian pilgrim. To them, the crocodile was not only an animal, but a channel of divine power. Feeding it was an act of piety. Watching it devour offerings was a blessing. The feeder, standing at the center of this ritual, was part of a bridge between gods and mortals. To us, it seems extraordinary to risk one's life in service of a reptile. To them, it was service to Sobek, a duty that brought harmony between humans and the forces of the Nile. There is also something deeply symbolic in the act. The Nile gave life, but also brought danger. Crocodiles represented both sides of the river's power. By feeding the crocodile, the Egyptians acknowledged and appeased this danger, turning it into something sacred. The feeder's role was to mediate between the people and this embodiment of chaos, to turn fear into worship. His hands offered food, but his work offered peace of mind, reassuring pilgrims that Sobek was honored and would not unleash his wrath. The life of a crocodile feeder was likely simple in material terms. He may not have been wealthy or famous. His days were measured by baskets of fish, by the watching eyes of pilgrims, by the movements of a creature that could never truly be trusted. Yet in the eyes of those who came to the temple, his work was vital. Without him, the sacred crocodile might starve, the rituals fail, and the god grow angry. His was a profession built not on wealth, but on necessity and belief. When we picture this scene now, thousands of years later, it carries both wonder and unease. The idea of walking daily into the presence of such a creature, of leaning close to the water's edge with food in hand, is both fascinating and terrifying. Yet the crocodile feeder did not waver. He lived in a world where the gods walked among animals, where danger itself could be sacred, and where even the act of feeding a beast was woven into the eternal order of things. So among the strangest jobs of ancient Egypt, this one stands out not only for its danger, but also for its symbolism. To feed a crocodile was to feed a god, to risk one's life in devotion, and to hold in one's hands the delicate balance between fear and faith. The crocodile feeder reminds us that in Egypt, the line between the divine and the everyday was always thin, and those who crossed it often did so in ways that seem extraordinary to us now, but to them were simply part of the eternal rhythm of life along the Nile. Among the many roles that surrounded the Pharaoh of Egypt, some were grand and visible, filled with splendor and ceremony. Others were quieter, hidden from the eyes of the public, yet no less important. One of the strangest among them was that of the Pharaoh's bed companion, a person whose duty was to sleep near the Pharaoh at night. This was not a role of intimacy, as we might imagine it today, but a mixture of protection, ritual presence, and symbolic loyalty. In a world where rulers were seen as divine, even their knights required guardianship, and so this unusual job was born. The Pharaoh was the heart of Egypt, the link between gods and men. His life was considered so precious that no detail could be left to chance. By day, he was surrounded by guards, scribes, and officials. By night, when the palace fell quiet and the torches burned low, he could not be left unattended. Enemies might strike in the dark, spirits might wander, or ill fortune might descend while he slept. The bed companion's task was to be present, a silent guardian who shared the chamber, ensuring that the Pharaoh's rest remained undisturbed. Their body, their watchfulness, and even their breath became part of the king's protection. Imagine the stillness of a royal chamber at night. The walls are painted with images of gods, their forms glowing faintly in the flicker of oil lamps. Outside, the palace is quiet, the sounds of the Nile faint in the distance. On a raised bed draped in fine linen lies the Pharaoh, resting after a day of rule and ritual. Beside him, on a lower bed or mat, lies the companion, not asleep at first but wakeful, listening to the sounds of the night, alert for movement or disturbance. This person is neither fully guard nor fully servant, but something in between, a constant presence, a shadow of the king himself. The choice of bed companion was not random. It required trust, for to be allowed so near to the Pharaoh in his most vulnerable moments was a great honor, but also a great risk. Few were permitted into such closeness. The companion may have been a trusted official, a favored guard, or a servant raised to this singular duty. Whatever their origin, once chosen, they became part of the pharaoh's nightly life, a human shield against loneliness, danger, and the unknown. There was also a symbolic layer to the role. Egyptians believed that sleep was a time when the soul wandered, when dreams carried messages from the gods. To leave the pharaoh alone in such a state might expose him to spiritual harm. The presence of a companion was a kind of anchor, a reminder of the living world, someone whose steady breath in the darkness tied the ruler to life, even as his soul traveled elsewhere. In this way, the bed companion was both protector and witness, guarding not only the body, but the spirit of the divine king. We can imagine the long hours of such work. To lie beside a ruler meant setting aside one's own comfort. The companion did not sleep deeply, but lightly, always half aware, ears tuned to sounds of movement. Perhaps they watched shadows shift on the walls, listened to the sigh of the night wind, or the distant calls of animals outside the palace. At times, perhaps they dozed, but never fully. Their role was to be present, and presence required wakefulness as much as slumber. Night after night, their life followed the rhythm of the pharaoh's sleep. This job was unusual because it blurred boundaries. To guard the pharaoh at night was an honor, but it was also deeply intimate, a closeness few others would ever know. The companion saw the ruler not as the majestic figure of public ceremonies, but as a human being, tired, vulnerable, at rest. They heard his breath, perhaps his muttered dreams, the quiet groans of fatigue. In those moments, the pharaoh was less god and more man, and the companion bore witness to both sides. It was a strange intimacy built not on affection, but on duty. There was also danger in this role. If anything were to happen to the pharaoh in the night, an attack, an accident, or even a troubling dream, the companion would be the first suspected. To be so close meant to carry responsibility for safety, and failure could bring punishment, even death. Thus, the position demanded not only trust from the pharaoh, but loyalty from the companion. Their life was bound tightly to the ruler's, their fate inseparable from his. We might wonder what sort of person would accept such a role. Perhaps it was someone ambitious, eager to be near the center of power. Perhaps it was someone loyal, bound by gratitude or devotion. Or perhaps it was someone chosen simply for reliability, a figure steady enough to endure the long nights without faltering. Whatever the case, once chosen, the bed companion's life was forever changed, tethered each night to the rhythms of a king. The presence of a bed companion also reflected a deeper truth about Egyptian kingship, that the pharaoh was never truly alone. By day, he was the center of a court. By night, he was never left unguarded. His life was not his own, but belonged to Egypt, and so even his sleep was shared, protected, and witnessed. The bed companion embodied this principle, a living reminder that the pharaoh's body and spirit were always cared for, never left exposed to chance. It is easy for us to see this job as unusual, perhaps uncomfortable. To lie night after night in the shadow of such power must have been both awe-inspiring and exhausting. Yet for the Egyptians, it was simply another thread in the great fabric of divine kingship. Just as the sun god Ra needed a bark to carry him through the night sky, so too did the pharaoh need a companion to carry him safely through the hours of sleep. In this way, the human mirrored the divine, and the bed companion became a silent participant in the eternal cycle of protection and renewal. So, among the many strange jobs of ancient Egypt, this one stands quietly apart. It was neither loud nor visible, not marked by ceremonies or monuments, but it was deeply intimate, rooted in trust and responsibility. The pharaoh's bed companion was a guardian of sleep, a shadow in the night, a presence that ensured the ruler could rise each morning to greet the sun. It reminds us that even the greatest kings, even those worshipped as gods, required the simple comfort of knowing that someone watched over them in the darkness. Among the many jobs that surrounded the pharaoh and the nobility of Egypt, one of the strangest to our modern eyes was the role of the Sandal Bearer. To carry another person's shoes might seem like the humblest of tasks, even unnecessary, but in Egypt it was far more than a matter of convenience. The sandals of a king or noble were not just practical objects for walking. They were symbols of power, purity, and social order. And so, the job of Sandal Bearer was a recognized position, filled by individuals who walked at the side of greatness, holding in their hands the very objects that touched the ruler's feet. Sandals in Egypt were more than simple footwear. Made from leather, papyrus, or woven reeds, they protected the feet from the hot sands and rough ground. Yet for the pharaoh, they also carried symbolic weight. To place sandals upon his feet was to prepare him for walking in the presence of the gods. In art and inscriptions, sandals were sometimes depicted as being decorated with images of foreign enemies, so that each step the pharaoh took symbolically crushed his foes beneath him. To bear such sandals, then, was to carry a symbol of Egypt's power and divine authority. The sandal bearer's job was both simple and strangely important. He walked close to the pharaoh, carrying the sandals when the ruler was barefoot, ready to present them whenever needed. In ceremonies, processions, or daily routines, the sandal bearer ensured that the footwear was kept clean, protected, and always at hand. The image of a servant walking beside the king, sandals in hand, became a recognizable sign of status. It told the world that this person had the honor of serving so closely to the ruler, touching what few others would ever dare to handle. We might picture such a scene in the palace or temple. The pharaoh, adorned in fine linen, walks barefoot across polished stone floors, his steps deliberate and solemn. Beside him walks the sandal bearer, holding the sandals with care, their straps neatly arranged, their surfaces polished. At the moment the pharaoh pauses, the bearer kneels, offering the sandals as though they were treasures. With reverence, they are placed upon the king's feet, not merely to protect, but to symbolize his readiness to stride forth as the embodiment of divine authority. When the sandals are removed, they are once again taken into the bearer's hands, held as objects worthy of respect. Though the task might seem lowly, to be so near the pharaoh carried honor. The sandal bearer was part of the ruler's inner circle, trusted to remain close at all times. In some cases, the position could even be a stepping stone to greater responsibility. For while the job itself was humble, it required loyalty, attentiveness, and constant presence. To walk beside the pharaoh was to be noticed, and in a court where proximity to power mattered greatly, even the bearer of sandals could rise in influence through his closeness. There was also a ritual purity tied to the job. Shoes carried the dust and dirt of the earth, and in sacred spaces, the pharaoh was expected to be pure, free from the contamination of the outside world. To remove his sandals before entering a temple was a sacred act, a recognition of divine presence. The sandal bearer ensured that this ritual was observed correctly, that the sandals were removed at the proper moment and restored afterward. In this way, his role was not only practical but ceremonial, woven into the very structure of religious practice. The symbolism extended further. In Egyptian art, sandals were sometimes placed in tombs as offerings, ensuring the dead could walk in the afterlife. In some cases, sandals were inscribed with protective symbols or names, guarding the wearer from harm. The sandal bearer, therefore, was not simply handling shoes. He was handling objects that carried magical and religious significance. To treat them carelessly would have been unthinkable. To carry them properly was to carry a small piece of the pharaoh's divine authority. We might imagine the life of such a person. His days were spent at the ruler's side, following wherever he went, always alert, always ready. He had to rise early, ensure the sandals were prepared, straps strong, surfaces polished, perhaps scented with oils to keep the leather supple. During processions, he had to move gracefully, never stumbling, never allowing the sandals to touch the ground until the pharaoh needed them. His eyes watched not only the sandals, but the movements of the ruler, anticipating his needs. It was a life of service, yes, but also of constant attention, where even a small mistake could be seen as disrespect to the king himself. It is easy to dismiss such a role as strange or unnecessary, yet it reveals much about Egyptian society. Every detail of the pharaoh's life was considered important, every object a symbol. To walk barefoot or to wear sandals was not simply a choice of comfort, but an act filled with meaning. The Sandal Bearer's presence underscored this, showing that even the smallest of tasks could be elevated into a matter of ritual and honor. In a world where the pharaoh was both man and god, nothing he touched was ordinary, not even his sandals. We might also reflect on how the bearer himself saw his role. Perhaps he took pride in his nearness to power, in the knowledge that he stood closer to the pharaoh than many officials of higher rank. Perhaps he dreamed of rising further, using this trusted position as a step toward greater responsibility. Or perhaps he accepted his duty with quiet humility, content to serve in silence, knowing that his presence, though unnoticed by the world, mattered to the rhythm of royal life. Whatever the case, his was a strange profession, one that blended service, symbolism, and closeness to divine authority in a way unique to ancient Egypt. So when we look back on this unusual job, we see not just a servant with shoes in hand, but a figure woven into the very tapestry of kingship. The Sandal Bearer reminds us that power is built not only on armies and monuments, but also on the countless small acts of service that surrounded the throne. To carry sandals may seem a humble duty, but in the world of the pharaoh, it was a role that touched upon ritual, purity, and the mystery of divine rule. And so, in the quiet shadow of great rulers, the Sandal Bearer walked, holding in his hands the simple yet sacred objects that connected a god-king to the earth beneath his feet. Among the many forgotten workers who kept ancient Egypt functioning, one of the strangest and least glamorous jobs was that of the Dung Collector. To modern ears, it sounds unpleasant, even laughable, but in a society where animals were everywhere, from the markets to the temples, someone had to deal with the endless waste they produced. In Egypt, this task became a profession of its own, one that reveals the practical realities of life along the Nile and the hidden labor that made great cities and temples livable. The people of Egypt depended on animals in countless ways. Donkeys carried loads, oxen plowed the fields, geese and ducks filled courtyards with sound, and cattle were raised for both work and food. In the temples, sacred animals lived in honor, tended by priests. In the streets of towns, goats, sheep, and even pigs wandered freely. Each of these creatures produced waste, and in a hot climate, left uncollected, it quickly became not just a nuisance, but a danger. Disease could spread, smells could overwhelm, and the sanctity of sacred spaces could be spoiled. The Dung Collector's role was to prevent such chaos, to move through streets, stables, and courtyards, gathering what others preferred to ignore. Imagine the streets of an Egyptian town. The sun blazes overhead, vendors call out in the marketplace, and people move with baskets of bread, jars of beer, or rolls of papyrus. Alongside them, animals shuffle and bray, leaving droppings in their wake. Into this scene steps the Dung Collector, carrying baskets, scoops, and perhaps a simple cart. With practiced movements, he bends, gathers, and clears the waste, tossing it into his container. The work is unending, for the animals never stop, and the collector must always move quickly to keep the roads passable and the air tolerable. His presence may not have been celebrated, but without him, the streets would soon have been unbearable. Dung in Egypt was not merely waste, it was also a resource. Farmers used animal droppings to fertilize their fields, mixing it with mud to enrich the soil for grain and vegetables. In a land where the Nile's flooding brought fertility, but also demanded constant renewal, manure was valuable. Dung was also mixed with straw to create fuel for fires, pressed into patties that could be dried and burned. For households without wood, this became an essential source of cooking heat. Thus, the collector's work fed into cycles of use and reuse. What seemed unpleasant became, in the eyes of Egyptians, something useful, even necessary for survival. The job extended into sacred spaces as well. In temples where sacred animals roamed or were housed, cleanliness was paramount. Priests could not allow dung to accumulate where offerings were made or rituals performed. The dung collector in such a setting worked quietly in the background, ensuring that the presence of holy creatures did not sully the temple's purity. It was a humble job, but in a world where the gods demanded perfection, it mattered deeply. To leave filth in a temple was to insult the divine. To remove it was an act of devotion as much as labor. One might wonder who took on such work. Likely it fell to the lower classes, people with few other opportunities. Yet even so, their job gave them a role in the great machinery of Egyptian life. They may not have been honored with titles or monuments, but they ensured the functioning of cities, the cleanliness of markets, and the sanctity of temples. Their work was invisible precisely because it was effective. When done well, no one noticed. When done poorly, everyone suffered. The collector's life must have been one of routine, moving from place to place, basket growing heavy as the day went on. Perhaps they worked in small teams, gathering waste, loading carts, and transporting it outside the city to be sold as fertilizer or dried for fuel. The smell was constant, the labor unending, but in a way, it connected them to the very cycles of life and death. Waste from animals returned to the soil, which fed crops, which fed people and animals again. The collector, though low in status, was a link in the eternal chain that sustained Egypt. We can also imagine the social side of their work. In markets, the collector would have moved among crowds, quietly doing what needed to be done. Vendors may have nodded in recognition, grateful that their stalls did not stink of filth. Farmers may have purchased the gathered dung for their fields, turning the collector's labor into value. In this way, the work, though unpleasant, was tied into the economy. Even the most humble labor had its place in the grand structure of Egyptian society. To us, it may seem strange to think of a job dedicated to collecting dung, but for the Egyptians, it was practical, and practicality was sacred in its own way. A society that could build pyramids and write prayers to gods also needed clean streets and fertile soil. The dung collector reminds us that history is not only about kings and priests, but also about those who worked in silence, ensuring that life could continue smoothly. Without them, temples would be unclean, markets unbearable, and farms less fruitful. The job also carries a quiet dignity when we look at it closely. Though lowly, it was honest work, serving both gods and men. It required resilience, for the collector endured smells and sights that others avoided. It required persistence, for the work was never finished. And it required acceptance, for one's role was not to shine, but to clear away what others left behind. In this way, the collector embodied humility, performing a task both necessary and thankless, yet woven into the fabric of Egypt's survival. So in the long list of Egypt's unusual jobs, the dung collector stands as a reminder of the hidden labor that sustained a great civilization. Strange, unglamorous, yet essential. This work reveals the truth that even the mightiest of kingdoms rests on the quiet toil of those whose names we do not know. The temples gleamed, the fields yielded grain, the markets bustled with life, but behind all of it, somewhere in the background, a humble worker carried a basket, clearing dung beneath the blazing Egyptian sun. When we think of beer today, we imagine a drink for the living shared among friends, enjoyed at feasts, poured at celebrations. But in ancient Egypt, beer belonged not only to the world of the living, it was also a gift for the dead. Among the more unusual professions of the Nile was the role of the beer brewer for the dead, a person who devoted their labor to creating jars of beer, not for taverns or households, but for tombs, offerings, and eternal feasts in the afterlife. Beer was central to Egyptian life. It was not a luxury, but a staple, consumed daily by farmers, workers, and nobles alike. Made from barley loaves mashed in water and left to ferment, it was thick, nutritious, and filling. It provided both sustenance and refreshment, a food and drink in one. The Egyptians called it heket or tenemu, and it was as essential as bread. But just as the living needed it, so too did the dead, for the Egyptians believed that life after death mirrored life on earth. The deceased would require food, drink, and comfort for eternity, and so offerings of beer became part of the burial rites. The beer brewer for the dead specialized in preparing this sacred drink. Their work was not simply brewing for daily consumption, but crafting beer that would be placed in jars and sealed within tombs, ready to nourish the soul in the afterlife. Sometimes the beer was brewed in special workshops attached to temples or mortuary complexes, where priests and workers devoted their labor to creating offerings. Other times, brewers were hired by families to prepare specific batches for their loved ones' tombs. In either case, their work carried a weight of ritual. They were not just feeding people, but sustaining eternity. Imagine the process of brewing in an Egyptian village. The brewer begins by baking loaves of barley bread, dense and partially cooked. These are crumbled into large vats of water, where they ferment. Frothing as yeast works its invisible magic. Dates or honey might be added to sweeten the brew, giving it richness. The mixture is stirred, left to settle, then poured into jars through woven strainers. The air is filled with the yeasty, earthy scent of fermentation, the quiet bubbling of beer coming to life. For the living, it would soon be ready to drink. For the dead, the jars would be sealed with clay stoppers, painted, and carried into the silence of tombs. The idea may seem strange to us, but to Egyptians it was entirely natural. Just as we might send flowers to a grave, they sent food and beer. But while flowers fade, beer in sealed jars carried both practical and symbolic value. It could physically sustain those who entered the tomb to perform rituals, and more importantly, it provided spiritual sustenance to the deceased. Inscriptions often depict the dead seated before tables laden with bread, beer, meat, and fruit. These were not symbolic meals alone. They were expected offerings, renewed regularly by the living or created magically through ritual. The beer brewer for the dead ensured that one of the most important items of this eternal meal was always ready. In some cases, the beer jars were inscribed with spells, prayers, or the names of the deceased. The brewer's work, therefore, was not only physical but spiritual. The drink became a vessel of blessing, a way for the dead to remain nourished in the next world. Without beer, the afterlife would be incomplete, lacking one of the fundamental comforts of earthly life. The brewer's task was thus more vital than it may appear. They were feeding the soul itself. One can imagine the quiet pride of such a worker. Though their job was humble, they knew that their hands prepared sustenance not for days or weeks, but for eternity. Every jar placed in a tomb was a promise that the dead would not go thirsty, that their journey beyond the grave would not be one of hunger. In a society where memory and ritual were everything, the beer brewer for the dead provided a gift more lasting than monuments, a daily comfort for the spirit. This profession also tied into the great festivals of the dead. During celebrations when families gathered to honor ancestors, beer was brewed in abundance, offered at tombs, poured onto the earth, or left in jars among offerings. The brewer's role was essential here too, for without their craft, the ceremonies could not be complete. They were part of the cycle of remembrance, their labor ensuring that the bond between the living and the dead remained unbroken. It is worth noting how common beer was in Egypt, and how its presence in tombs reflected a deeply human desire, that life after death be familiar, filled with the same comforts enjoyed in life. For workers on the pyramids, beer was part of their daily rations. For farmers, it was the drink that quenched thirst under the blazing sun. For nobles, it was a pleasure at banquets. And for the dead, It was a necessity, provided by brewers whose hands shaped clay jars, filled with frothing, nourishing drink. Beer united all levels of society, binding the living and the dead in shared sustenance. So the beer brewer for the dead, though little remembered, was part of the foundation of Egyptian ritual life. Their strange profession reminds us that the Egyptians blurred the line between this world and the next, that they believed continuity stretched across death itself. What you needed in life, you needed in eternity, and it was the brewer's task to provide it. In their vats and jars, they prepared not just a drink, but a bridge, ensuring that the dead could taste the sweetness of life long after their bodies were sealed away. Among the many unusual jobs of ancient Egypt, this one feels both peculiar and deeply human. Peculiar, because to us the idea of brewing beer for the dead seems odd, unnecessary, even fantastical. But human, because at its heart it was about care, memory, and love. Families wanted their loved ones to be comfortable in eternity, and brewers provided the means. Their work was a mixture of practicality and devotion, born of a belief that nothing was too small to matter when it came to eternity. So in the dark chambers of tombs, far beneath the desert sands, jars still sit, their stoppers sealed thousands of years ago. They are silent now, their contents dried or evaporated, but once they held the beer of the afterlife, the product of hands that worked not for applause, but for the comfort of the unseen. In that silence, the work of the beer brewer for the dead lingers, a quiet reminder that even the simplest of labors can carry the weight of eternity. Of all the professions in ancient Egypt, few were as eerie or unsettling as the work of the embalmers. They were the men who prepared the dead for eternity, who opened bodies, removed organs, and wrapped them in endless rolls of linen. But within their shadowy workshops, there were many levels of labor, and not everyone held the same skill or honor. At the lowest rung stood the embalmer's assistants, men who performed the most unpleasant, grisly, and necessary tasks. Their role, though humble, was vital to the creation of a proper mummy, and through their hands, the body of the deceased was transformed into a vessel fit for eternity. The Egyptians believed that preserving the body was essential for survival in the afterlife. Without a body, the soul could not recognize itself, could not live again. And so, embalming became one of the most important rituals in their culture. The process, however, was long and complex, requiring not only priests skilled in ritual, but also laborers willing to do the work others would not. These were the assistants, the hidden workers in the embalming houses, whose lives were bound to the strange world of death. Imagine such a place, a workshop on the edge of town, far from ordinary houses, for few wished to live near it. The air carries the scent of resins, natron salts, and smoke. The walls are lined with jars, baskets, and tools. In the center lies a table of stone or wood upon which rests the body of the deceased. Around it move the embalmers and their assistants, each with their tasks. The priests chant prayers. The chief embalmer makes the first incisions, but it is often the assistants who handle the rest, the removal of organs, the scraping of flesh, the endless washing and salting. Their hands are never clean, their work never gentle, yet without them, the rituals could not be completed. One of the assistants' primary tasks was to remove the internal organs. This was not done with delicacy. The stomach, intestines, liver, and lungs had to be taken out, cleaned, and preserved in special jars called canopic jars. The assistants did the lifting, the carrying, the careful placement of each organ into its vessel. They also dealt with what could not be saved, discarding waste far from the workshop. The heart, believed to be the seat of the soul, was sometimes left in the body and sometimes removed. Whatever the choice, the assistant had to ensure the work was carried out swiftly before decay set in under the Egyptian sun. After the organs were removed, the assistants prepared the body for drying. They filled it with natron, a kind of natural salt found in the desert, which drew moisture from the flesh. The assistants carried heavy baskets of natron, pouring it into and around the body, making sure every part was covered. For 40 days or more, the body remained buried in salt, and the assistants checked it regularly, ensuring that the process worked, that no rock remained. It was dirty, exhausting work, involving constant lifting, bending, and carrying. Yet it was essential, for without complete drying, the body would not last. When the drying was complete, the assistants helped in the next stage, the wrapping. This required vast quantities of linen, strips upon strips, wound around every limb, every finger, every toe. The assistants prepared the linen, cutting it, smoothing it, dipping some in resin for added strength. They handed strips to the embalmers, who recited prayers as they wrapped. But it was the assistants who ensured there was enough material, who lifted and turned the body, who layered the wrappings until the form was secure. Sometimes amulets were placed within the linen, and the assistants helped pass them, ensuring they were set in the correct position. It was a process both repetitive and delicate, demanding patience that stretched into long hours. The embalming houses were not quiet places. They were filled with the sounds of work, scraping, pouring, wrapping, chanting. Assistants moved constantly, carrying jars of oils and resins, heating substances until they were liquid, applying them to the body. Their clothes were stained with salt, their skin burned by strong resins, their noses filled with the pungent smell of preservation. And though their work was vital, their place in society was uneasy. To touch the dead was to risk ritual impurity, and many Egyptians avoided embalmers, treating them with suspicion or fear. The assistants, being the lowest in the hierarchy, bore the brunt of this. They lived on the margins, respected for their role, yet shunned for the same reason. We can imagine the strange rhythm of their lives. By day, they worked in shadows, their hands busy with the dead. By night, they returned home, perhaps to families, carrying the smell of their work on their clothes. Did their children shy away from them? Did neighbors whisper? Or did they accept that this was necessary labor, unpleasant but sacred? The answer may have been both. To preserve the dead was to serve the gods, but to live always among death was to stand apart from the living. Despite their low status, the assistants were part of something greater. Their labor allowed the embalmers to complete the rituals, the priests to speak their prayers, the families to find comfort in seeing their loved ones prepared with dignity. Each task, however unpleasant, was a step toward eternity for the deceased. In this way, the assistants shared in a strange kind of immortality. Their names are lost, but the mummies they helped create endure. In museums today, when we see the wrapped bodies of pharaohs and nobles, we are seeing the work of these forgotten hands, preserved across millennia. The embalmer's assistant reminds us that history is built not only by those in power, but also by those in the shadows, whose labor, often unseen, shapes the world. Their job was grim, exhausting, and often thankless, but it was also indispensable. Without them, Egypt's great rituals of death would have faltered, and the vision of eternal life might never have been sustained. Their profession, strange and unsettling, stands as a testament to the extremes of human devotion to belief and tradition. So among the strangest jobs of ancient Egypt, the embalmer's assistant occupies a place both humble and haunting. They were men who lived with death, who touched what others feared, who worked with patience and endurance in service of eternity. Their lives may have been hidden, their names forgotten, but their labor endures in every bandage, every preserved body, every mummy that still lies wrapped beneath the sands of Egypt. Among the many unusual jobs in ancient Egypt, one stands out for its mixture of sweetness and danger: the role of the Pharaoh's beekeeper. In a land of scorching deserts and fertile riverbanks, bees were treasured not only for their honey, but for their wax, their symbolic power, and their connection to the gods. To care for them was a task of skill, patience, and bravery, for even in ancient times, bees could not be commanded. They had to be understood, coaxed, and respected. The Pharaoh's beekeeper lived in this delicate balance, providing honey for offerings, medicines, and the royal table, while also tending creatures believed to embody the tears of the sun god Re. Honey was more than food to the Egyptians. It was medicine, offering healing for wounds and illnesses. It was used in cosmetics, mixed with oils to soften the skin or blended into perfumes. It was also sacred, offered to the gods in rituals, and placed in tombs as nourishment for the afterlife. In a world where sugar was unknown, honey was the sweetest substance, rare and precious, a taste of divinity itself. To keep bees, therefore, was not merely practical, it was a spiritual duty, one that connected the Pharaoh's household to both health and the gods. The beekeeper's work began at the hives, which in Egypt were not wooden boxes like those we know today, but long cylinders made of clay or woven reeds, stacked horizontally in rows. These were placed near fields of clover or wildflowers, often close to the fertile banks of the Nile, where bees could find abundant nectar. The keeper had to rise early, watching the hives, noting the hum of activity, ensuring the bees were healthy. They wore little protection, perhaps a veil of cloth at times, but often nothing at all. Instead, they relied on smoke to calm the bees, burning dried herbs or dung to create gentle plumes that lulled the insects into quiet. Then, with steady hands, they opened the hives, reached inside, and gathered the golden cones dripping with honey. It was dangerous work. A single sting was painful, but dozens could be overwhelming. Yet the beekeepers endured, their skin often marked by the labor of their profession. Their bravery was respected, for not all could face the angry swarm and return with honey in hand. To the Egyptians, this courage carried weight, for bees were more than insects. They were seen as sacred messengers, linked to the gods. One myth even said that bees were born from the tears of Ra, falling to earth and transforming into these winged creatures that brought sweetness and light. To harm a bee carelessly was not only unwise but irreverent, for each swarm carried divine significance. The Pharaoh's beekeeper, then, was more than a farmer. They were a caretaker of sacred creatures. Their honey went not only to the royal kitchens, but also to the temples, where it was mixed with offerings, poured in libations, or used in embalming practices. Beeswax, too, was highly valued. It was shaped into small figures for rituals, melted into lamps for light, and sealed jars to preserve contents. Every product of the hive had purpose, and the beekeeper's work extended far beyond the sweet taste of honey. Imagine such a scene in the cool morning air. Before the desert sun climbs high, the beekeeper kneels beside the clay hives. Smoke curls upward as he wafts it gently, calming the restless swarm. With practiced motion, he lifts a cone glistening with honey, its cells perfect and symmetrical, golden light catching on its surface. Around him, the hum of bees fills the air, a sound both soothing and dangerous. He places the cone into a basket, covers it with cloth, and moves on to the next. The air smells of smoke and sweetness, a blend of labor and reward. This is the daily rhythm of a profession that fed both men and gods. The work did not end with harvesting. The beekeeper had to strain the honey, separating it from wax, pouring it into jars, sealing them with clay or wax to preserve them. Some jars were sent to the Pharaoh's household to be served with bread or blended into drinks. Others were carried to temples, offered to gods in ceremonies. Still others were placed in tombs, ensuring that the dead could taste sweetness in eternity. Each jar carried the mark of the beekeeper's labor, though his name was rarely recorded. His work, though humble, was part of the foundation of Egyptian ritual and daily life. The beekeeper's profession also reveals the Egyptians' deep respect for nature. They saw the order of the hive as a reflection of cosmic order, the harmony of many working for one. The bees' tireless labor mirrored the endless cycles of the Nile, the rising and falling of the sun. To watch a hive was to glimpse the divine structure of the world, and the beekeeper, standing at its heart, became a mediator between insects, humans, and gods. His role was strange, for he worked with creatures few dared to approach, but it was also exalted, for his work sustained health, worship, and the sweetness of life itself. We might imagine how others viewed him. Perhaps children watched from a distance, curious and a little afraid of the buzzing clouds. Perhaps priests greeted him with respect as he delivered honey for rituals. Perhaps nobles thanked him for jars of sweetness at feasts. Yet behind each gesture lay the memory of danger, the knowledge that his work was not easy. Every jar of honey carried with it the risk of stings, the courage of facing a swarm, the patience of laboring with creatures that could never be truly tamed. In this way, the Pharaoh's beekeeper embodied both strangeness and necessity. His was a job that required bravery, patience, and care, a job that touched both the earth and the heavens. He lived in the hum of wings, the sweetness of honey, the sting of danger, and the respect of those who depended on his craft. Though his name is lost, his work survives in the countless jars of honey found in tombs, still preserved after thousands of years, a silent testament to the strange, sweet labor of one of Egypt's most unusual professions. Among the many unusual professions in ancient Egypt, one stood at the crossroads of art, devotion, and ritual: the temple dancer. To modern eyes, dancing may seem like simple entertainment, something meant to amuse guests or bring joy at a celebration. But in the sacred spaces of Egypt, it was far more than that. To dance before the gods was to offer movement as prayer, to turn the body into an instrument of worship. The temple dancer lived in this strange space, performing not for ordinary audiences, but for divine ones, using grace, rhythm, and music as a bridge between mortals and the eternal. Music and dance held a central place in Egyptian culture. At festivals, banquets, and processions, dancers and musicians filled the air with sound and movement. Yet in temples, their work took on a different weight. Dancers were part of ceremonies dedicated to the gods, moving in harmony with hymns, clapping rhythms, and the sound of sistrum's sacred rattles that drove away evil and pleased the divine. Theirs was a job that required discipline and skill, for each movement was symbolic, each gesture charged with meaning. They were not simply performers, but ritualists, offering their bodies in devotion. Imagine a great festival in honor of Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and joy. The temple courtyard fills with worshippers. Priests chant hymns, and musicians play lutes, harps, and flutes. In the center, the dancers step forward, adorned in flowing linen, their hair braided and decorated with flowers. They begin to move, slow at first, their hands raised in gestures that symbolize offerings, their feet gliding in time with the music. Then the rhythm grows faster, the clapping louder, the dance more animated, until the crowd sways with them, caught in the joy of the performance. To the Egyptians, this was not entertainment. It was the goddess herself being honored, her presence invited into the gathering through movement and sound. The temple dancer's role was not confined to public festivals. Within the more private spaces of temples, dances were performed before statues of gods, during rituals that marked the turning of the seasons, the rising of the Nile, or the offering of sacrifices. In such settings, the dancers' movements were seen only by priests and by the god whose image they served. Theirs was a performance without audience in the ordinary sense, offered directly to the divine. To move before a god was both an honor and a responsibility, for a misstep was not just clumsy, but irreverent. The dancers' discipline had to be perfect, their body honed for both beauty and devotion. There was also a magical dimension to this work. Egyptians believed that movement, sound, and rhythm had power to influence unseen forces. To shake the sistrum was to drive away evil spirits. To dance in certain patterns was to echo the order of the cosmos, reinforcing harmony against the threat of chaos. In this sense, the temple dancer was both performer and magician, using the body to shape the invisible. Their profession was strange to us, for it demanded not applause, but faith, the faith that every step and gesture carried meaning in the eyes of the gods. The training for such dancers must have been demanding. From youth, they likely practiced movements, learned rhythms, and trained their bodies to endure long performances beneath the hot Egyptian sun. They had to master both grace and stamina, for dances could stretch across ceremonies lasting hours. Some came from noble families, others from humble backgrounds, chosen for their beauty, talent, or devotion. Once trained, they entered a life of service to the temple, their days filled with practice, performance, and ritual duties. Their identities were shaped not as individuals, but as vessels of divine presence. We might wonder what it felt like to live such a life. Perhaps the temple dancer felt pride in standing so close to the gods, moving in the heart of rituals that shaped the destiny of Egypt. Perhaps they felt joy in the music, the rhythm of drums and rattles, the flow of movement through their body. Yet perhaps there was also pressure, the weight of knowing that their every gesture was observed not only by human eyes, but by divine ones. To falter was to fail the gods themselves, a burden that demanded constant focus and discipline. Dancing also carried ambiguity in Egyptian society. At banquets and feasts, dancers provided entertainment, sometimes in ways seen as sensual or playful. But in temples, their work was sacred, elevated above mere performance. The temple dancer moved between these worlds, both entertainer and priestly servant, both admired for beauty and honored for devotion. This duality made their role strange, blending art, ritual, and symbolism in ways that defy modern categories. One can picture the quiet moments after such performances. The music fades, the dancers lower their arms, the crowd disperses, and the temple grows still again. The dancers breathe heavily, sweat glistening on their skin, their bodies both exhausted and exalted. They have offered not words, not objects, but themselves, the movement of their limbs, the rhythm of their hearts. In that silence, they may have felt both emptiness and fulfillment, a sense that their role was both humble and profound. They had given their bodies to the gods, and in doing so, had upheld the balance between humans and the divine. The temple dancer reminds us that in Egypt, even art was sacred. Music, movement, and rhythm were not luxuries, but necessities, woven into the very structure of worship. To us, it may seem unusual that a dancer could be considered a religious figure, but to them it was entirely natural. Just as bread and beer fed the body, so dance and song fed the soul, sustaining both gods and men in the eternal cycle of life. So among the strangest jobs of ancient Egypt, the temple dancer holds a place both beautiful and enigmatic. Neither holy priest nor holy entertainer, they lived in the space between devotion and art. Their profession reminds us that in Egypt, the divine was everywhere in bread, in beer, in animals, and even in the graceful movement of human bodies beneath the sun. Theirs was a life of rhythm and reverence, a strange and sacred dance that continues to echo softly across the sands of time. Of all the professions in ancient Egypt, few carried as much mystery and ritual weight as that of the incense maker. To us, incense may seem like a simple luxury, something to perfume a room or create a pleasant atmosphere. But to the Egyptians, incense was far more than fragrance. It was the very breath of the gods, a bridge between heaven and earth. The smoke that rose from burning incense was thought to carry prayers upward, to purify spaces, and to please the divine. Those who made it were not mere craftsmen, but alchemists of scent, workers who dealt in ingredients drawn from the farthest corners of the world, blending them into mixtures both sacred and powerful. Incense was essential to temple rituals. Each morning, priests approached the statues of gods, washed them, dressed them, and anointed them with oils. Then they lit incense, filling the chamber with clouds of fragrance. To the Egyptians, the gods delighted in these scents. Without incense, no offering was complete, no ritual whole. It was the medium that made divine presence tangible, the veil that transformed stone statues into living gods. And so the work of the incense maker carried profound importance, for if the incense was poor, the gods themselves might turn away in displeasure. The recipes for incense were secrets, carefully guarded by temple priests and artisans. Some of the most famous blends, such as kifi, combined as many as 16 ingredients: honey, raisins, wine, myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, cedar, and more, ground together into a paste, then shaped into pellets that burned slowly, releasing a rich and complex fragrance. To prepare such a mixture required both knowledge and patience. The incense maker measured each ingredient, ground them on stone slabs, blended them in exact proportions, and allowed them to age. It was work as delicate as preparing medicine, for each element carried not only a scent, but a symbolic meaning, a connection to the divine order. Imagine the workshop of an incense maker. The air is thick with the aroma of spices, resins, and herbs. Jars line the walls, filled with dried plants, chunks of resin, and powders brought by traders from distant lands. The worker kneels at a low table, grinding myrrh with a stone pestle, the sound of crushing echoing softly. He adds wine, stirring until the mixture glistens. Honey is poured, sticky and golden, binding the powders together. His hands move slowly, with care, for he knows that what he prepares will be offered to the gods themselves. Around him, the scents mingle, filling the room with a sweetness so strong it seems to cling to the very walls. The incense maker's profession was not without challenges. Many of the ingredients were rare and expensive, imported from places far beyond Egypt's borders. Frankincense and myrrh came from the land of Punt, reached only through long and perilous voyages by ship. Cinnamon may have come from as far as India, carried through complex trade networks. To obtain these materials was itself an act of devotion and power, showing Egypt's reach across the world. Once in hand, they became the tools of the incense maker, whose task was to transform them into offerings worthy of the gods. To waste them was unthinkable. To mix them poorly was sacrilege. The symbolism of incense ran deep. Each scent carried meaning: frankincense for purity, myrrh for healing, cinnamon for vitality, cedar for strength. Together they created not only fragrance but harmony, a representation of the ordered cosmos. To burn incense was to invite this harmony into the world, to banish chaos and impurity. The rising smoke was a visual prayer, curling upward in delicate tendrils, disappearing into the unseen. To stand in a temple filled with incense was to stand between worlds, enveloped in the breath of the gods. The incense maker's hands, though unseen, shaped this experience. We might wonder about the daily life of such a person. Likely, they spent much of their time in preparation, grinding and blending, ensuring supplies for the constant rituals of the temples. Their work was repetitive, yet never simple, for each batch required precision. They may have worked under the supervision of priests, or in workshops attached to temples, their profession tied directly to worship. Some may have served the Pharaoh's household, creating incense for private rituals or for embalming the dead. Wherever they worked, their labor was both practical and sacred, touching every part of Egyptian life. Even in death, incense was present. During mummification, resins and aromatics were used to preserve the body, to purify it, to protect it against decay. In tombs, incense was burned as offerings, its smoke guiding the soul into the afterlife. The jars of resin found in burials were the silent work of incense makers, their craft carried into eternity. In this way, their profession bridged both life and death, shaping rituals that sustained the living and comforted the dead. It is easy to overlook such a job, for its products vanish into the air, leaving no trace. But in the faint smoke of incense, we glimpse the devotion of those who labored in secrecy, blending, grinding, and offering. Their work was invisible, yet indispensable, a thread that ran through every temple, every ritual, every prayer. The incense maker's craft was one of transformation, turning raw materials into something greater than their parts, something that could reach the gods themselves. So among the strangest jobs of ancient Egypt, the incense maker holds a place both fragrant and mysterious. Their profession was not dangerous like feeding crocodiles or strange like professional mourners, but it carried a weight of secrecy and power. They dealt with invisible forces, creating something that could not be touched or held, only breathed and felt. Their work reminds us that the Egyptians saw meaning in every detail of life, that even a whiff of smoke could carry the weight of eternity. And so, though forgotten by name, the incense maker's labor lingers still, in the lingering sense of temples long silent, and in the memory of a people who believed that fragrance itself was a gift of the gods. In the bustling towns and storerooms of ancient Egypt, where grain was piled high and food offerings filled temples, there lurked a small but relentless enemy, the rat. These creatures crept into granaries at night, gnawed through baskets, and spoiled precious supplies. For a society that relied so heavily on stored grain to survive the months between harvests, rats were more than a nuisance. They were a threat to life itself. Out of this constant struggle arose one of the stranger professions of the Nile Valley, the rat catcher, a worker whose job was to stalk, trap, and drive away these ever-present pests. To understand the importance of this role, one must first remember how central grain was to Egyptian society. Barley and emmer wheat formed the foundation of their diet, baked into bread and brewed into beer. Taxes were often paid in grain, stored in massive granaries overseen by scribes and officials. Temples, too, depended on grain offerings to sustain rituals and to feed priests and sacred animals. A single infestation could mean loss not only for families, but for the gods themselves. The rat catcher, therefore, became a guardian of abundance, a protector of food stores that kept both people and rituals alive. The methods of rat catching in ancient times were simple yet ingenious. The rat catcher might carry baskets and clay jars, laying traps baited with scraps of food. He might use nets or pits dug near storerooms, or rely on trained cats and even mongooses, creatures known for their skill in hunting rodents. Cats were deeply respected in Egypt, often associated with the goddess Bastet, and their role in controlling pests only added to their sacred reputation. The rat catcher often worked with these animals, releasing them into granaries or encouraging them to patrol homes. In this way, his profession combined human effort with the natural instincts of Egypt's feline companions. Imagine such a scene: a silent granary under the light of oil lamps, the air heavy with the scent of stored barley. The scribe records numbers on a tablet, priests chant prayers for protection, and in the shadows moves the rat catcher. His eyes scan the floor, watching for movement, listening for the faint scratching of claws. Beside him, a sleek cat prowls, its ears twitching, its body low to the ground. Suddenly, a flash of movement, a rat darts along the wall. The cat leaps, the catcher rushes forward, trap in hand. In the stillness that follows, another small battle in the endless war against vermin has been won. The rat catcher's job was not glamorous. It required patience, silence, and a willingness to spend long hours in dark, dusty storerooms. He often worked at night, when rats were most active, creeping quietly through warehouses while others slept. His hands became rough from handling traps. His clothes carried the smell of animals and grain. Yet his work carried real value. Without him, the stores could be lost, the people could starve, and the offerings to the gods could be diminished. He was, in his own way, a defender of both the living and the divine. There are even hints that rat catchers were recognized in Egyptian art and writing. Some depictions show small figures engaged in pest control, often with cats nearby. These images suggest that the role, though humble, was acknowledged as part of daily life. Just as there were scribes, farmers, and soldiers, there were also those whose task was to guard food against the smallest of enemies. Their names may be lost, but their presence is recorded in the quiet details of Egyptian history. The job also carried symbolic meaning. Rats represented chaos, destruction, and the forces that threatened order. The Egyptians valued Ma'at, the principle of balance and harmony, and to allow rats to overrun storerooms was to let chaos invade. The rat catcher, then, was not merely a practical worker, but a defender of order. Every rat he caught was a small victory for Ma'at, a reaffirmation that life and abundance would continue. In this way, his humble traps were as much tools of cosmic balance as the great rituals performed in temples. We might wonder what sort of person chose this work. Perhaps it was not a matter of choice, but of necessity, taken up by those who had few other options. Yet even so, the rat catcher filled a space that no one else could neglect. He likely worked for temples, estates, or local officials, his pay modest but steady, his role unglamorous but vital. Others may have avoided him, seeing his work as dirty or unpleasant, but when harvests came and stores were full, his value could not be denied. For in a land where survival depended on grain, to lose it to rats was a disaster too great to ignore. The profession also connected to Egypt's reverence for cats. Families welcomed cats into their homes not only as companions, but as protectors of food. To harm a cat was considered a grave offense, for they were both useful and sacred. The rat catcher's collaboration with these animals elevated his role, linking him to the divine favor of Bastet. His work was practical, yes, but also blessed by association with a goddess. Each captured rat was not only a relief to the household, but an offering to the principle of protection and order that cats symbolized. At the end of a long night, the rat catcher may have walked home with his baskets, tired but satisfied. His work was never done, for rats always returned, but each day without loss was a small victory. He may not have been honored with titles or monuments, yet his labor sustained the great engines of Egypt's society: the granaries, the temples, the homes of the people. Without him, chaos would gnaw at the edges of abundance, turning prosperity into hunger. With him, the stores remained full, the people fed, and the gods satisfied. So among the strangest jobs of ancient Egypt, the rat catcher holds a curious place. Neither priest nor warrior, he fought an enemy no larger than his hand, yet his victories carried weight for an entire civilization. His profession reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings and monuments, but also by those who worked in the shadows, guarding food against tiny teeth and restless claws. In the quiet battle between order and chaos, the rat catcher stood watch, ensuring that Egypt's abundance endured beneath the eternal sun. Of all the professions in ancient Egypt, few carried as much danger and mystery as that of the serpent charmer. To live in the Nile Valley was to share the land with snakes, some harmless, others deadly. Cobras slithered through the fields, vipers hid in the sand, and their sudden bite could bring death in moments. To the Egyptians, snakes were creatures of both fear and reverence. They were symbols of chaos and danger, but also of divine protection. The uraeus, the rearing cobra, adorned the crown of the Pharaoh as a sign of his authority, ready to spit fire upon his enemies. To charm and control such creatures was therefore more than spectacle. It was a profession that walked the line between survival, magic, and service to the gods. The serpent charmer's work was varied. Some were tasked with removing snakes from fields, homes, or temples, protecting people from their hidden strikes. Others were associated with rituals, using snakes in ceremonies that honored gods or warded off evil. Still others performed in public, displaying their strange mastery over reptiles to entertain or impress. Whatever their setting, the charmer's role was steeped in risk. To handle a cobra was to risk death with every movement, yet to succeed was to appear almost magical, a human with power over chaos itself. Imagine a farmer calling for help after finding snakes in his field. Into the tall grasses steps the serpent charmer, carrying a bag or basket, perhaps a flute or drum to keep rhythm. He scans the ground, listening for the hiss, watching for the sudden ripple of scales among the stalks. With calm precision, he lowers a stick or extends his hands, coaxing the creature out. A cobra rises, its hood flaring, tongue flicking in warning. The charmer moves slowly, his body steady, his breath even. The crowd that has gathered holds its breath. With practiced skill, he seizes the snake just behind its head, avoiding the deadly fangs. In one swift motion, it is secured, placed into a jar or basket, carried away from the village. Relief spreads through the people, for chaos has been driven back once more. In temples, the role could take on deeper significance. Serpent charmers were sometimes associated with magical rituals, calling upon the protection of gods like Wadjet, the cobra goddess who shielded the Pharaoh, or Adam, who battled the serpent Apophis in the underworld each night. To handle snakes in such contexts was to participate in cosmic struggles, to show that humans could mirror the divine fight against chaos. The charmer's gestures became symbolic, a performance not only of skill but of faith. By controlling the serpent, he demonstrated the triumph of order, Ma'at, over disorder, Isfit. The methods of serpent charmers are hard to know with certainty. Some may have used training, handling snakes regularly until they became accustomed to human presence. Others may have taken precautions, such as removing fangs or venom glands, though such practices were cruel and not always effective. Still others relied on knowledge of behavior, moving with patience, never making sudden motions. To the untrained eye, their ability to approach and even seemingly calm a cobra appeared supernatural. And in a culture where magic and religion blended seamlessly, their work was often seen not as trickery, but as evidence of hidden knowledge. There is also evidence that serpent charmers played a role in medicine. Egyptian texts include spells and remedies for snake bites, mixing practical herbs with incantations. The charmer, familiar with snakes, may have been called to identify the species that had bitten someone, or to perform rituals to draw out the venom. They stood at the intersection of danger and healing, feared for their intimacy with deadly creatures, but valued for the protection they could offer. Their work was both practical and mystical, a profession that straddled two worlds. We can imagine how others viewed them. Children may have watched from a distance, eyes wide at the sight of a man holding a cobra as though it were harmless. Farmers may have greeted them with gratitude, relieved to see their crops free from danger. Priests may have welcomed them into rituals, seeing their control of serpents as a mirror of divine order. Yet some must have looked at them with suspicion, whispering of dark powers, of secret spells that bound snakes to their will. To live as a serpent charmer was to live with both admiration and unease, respect and fear. The life of a charmer was never safe. A single mistake, a slip of the hand, a moment of distraction could bring a fatal bite. Even the most skilled could not always escape. Death was a constant companion, lurking in the flick of a serpent's tongue, the flash of its fangs. Yet this danger was part of the profession's allure. To see someone stand unflinching before a cobra was to glimpse a human being who seemed to hold chaos in his hands. It was awe-inspiring, unsettling, and strangely sacred all at once. In Egyptian belief, the serpent was not only a threat, but also a protector. The uraeus on the pharaoh's crown symbolized the cobra's ability to strike down enemies. The goddess Wadjet was often depicted as a rearing snake, her gaze fierce, her bite deadly to those who opposed Egypt. To handle snakes was therefore to touch the very symbols of divine authority. The charmer, in his strange way, embodied this paradox, feared for his closeness to danger, yet respected for his ability to master it. His job was not only to protect people from snakes, but to remind them of the balance between fear and power, chaos and order. At the end of a day's work, perhaps the serpent charmer sat quietly by the Nile, his baskets beside him, listening to the hum of insects in the dusk. His hands bore the marks of countless encounters. His body carried the memory of danger narrowly avoided. Yet he lived, day after day, in this strange intimacy with creatures most people fled from. His was a life of risk, patience, and mystery, shaped by the hiss of serpents and the respect of those who needed him. He may not have left monuments or inscriptions, but in the whispers of fear and awe that surrounded his profession, his legacy remains. So among the strangest jobs of ancient Egypt, the serpent charmer stands out as one of the most dangerous and mystical. His profession combined skill, faith, and courage, reminding us that to the Egyptians, even the most feared creatures could be woven into the fabric of religion and daily life. To charm a snake was to show that order could prevail over chaos, that humans, too, could take part in the eternal struggle that defined the universe. And so, in the hiss of a cobra and the steady hands of the charmer, we see both strangeness and meaning, danger and devotion, all bound together in one of the Nile's most unusual callings. Among the strangest and most fascinating jobs in ancient Egypt was that of the dream interpreter. While today we might dismiss dreams as the random wanderings of the mind, the Egyptians saw them as messages from the gods, windows into hidden truths, and warnings of things to come. To dream was to cross a threshold into another world, and to interpret those dreams required skill, knowledge, and a sense of the divine. The dream interpreter lived in this liminal space, part priest, part scholar, part seer, listening carefully to the visions of others, and offering guidance shaped by the unseen. Dreams held immense importance in Egyptian belief. The gods were thought to communicate through them, sending omens and instructions. To dream of water might suggest renewal. To dream of snakes might foretell danger. To dream of eating might mean abundance or, in some cases, illness. Each image carried weight, and to misread, it was to risk misfortune. The Egyptians even created dream books collections of symbols and their meanings so that interpreters could consult them. These texts listed hundreds of dream images, with notes such as, "If a man dreams he sees himself drinking warm beer, it means sorrow," or, "If a man dreams of seeing himself dead, it means long life." It was a profession built on this intricate web of symbolism, a craft that blended observation with mystery. Imagine a person arriving at the home of a dream interpreter in a village along the Nile, troubled by a strange dream. They describe it in detail. A bird flying into the house, a sudden flood rising, a statue speaking. The interpreter listens closely, nodding, weighing each image. He consults his memory, perhaps glancing at a dream book kept nearby, his fingers tracing the symbols on a papyrus scroll. Then he speaks slowly, explaining that the bird might mean a visitor is coming, that the flood could signal change or danger, that the speaking statue reflects the voice of a god offering guidance. His words bring both relief and caution, for they are seen not as guesses, but as truths revealed by the divine. Dream interpretation was not merely a private service. It played a role in temples as well. Some gods, such as Serapis or Imhotep, were associated with healing dreams. Priests trained in the art of interpretation would listen to their accounts in the morning and declare the meaning. In this way, dreams became part of the sacred dialogue between humans and the divine, with the interpreter serving as translator. Their work was not entertainment, but a serious responsibility, for health, fortune, and destiny might depend on their words. There was also a magical dimension to this role. Dream interpreters sometimes prepared rituals or amulets to ward off bad dreams or to encourage good ones. They might write protective spells on papyrus and place them under pillows, or recite incantations before sleep. To them, dreams were not only messages, but forces that could be shaped, influenced, or redirected. The interpreter, then, was part healer, part magician, part priest, weaving together belief and practice in a way that gave comfort to those who sought him. We might imagine how this profession was viewed by others. Many must have turned to the dream interpreter with hope, eager for guidance. Others may have feared him, wary of a man who claimed to read the mind of the gods. To sit before him was to reveal one's most intimate visions, strange and sometimes troubling. Did people tell him of nightmares filled with death, fire, and serpents? Did they whisper dreams of secret desires, of wealth, or of forbidden love? The interpreter became a confidant, one who knew the hidden lives of others, whose words could shape how they moved through the world. The life of a dream interpreter likely combined the mundane with the mystical. By day, he might live like anyone else, eating bread and beer, tending his family, walking along the Nile. But when others came to him with dreams, he stepped into another role, one filled with gravity and wonder. His small home or temple room became a space of listening and revelation, where ordinary people touched the edge of the divine. In a society so deeply attuned to signs and omens, his role was indispensable, for he offered clarity in the face of uncertainty. It is striking how human this profession feels even now. Across cultures and times, people have long sought meaning in dreams, wondering whether they reveal hidden truths. The Egyptians gave this wonder structure, turning it into a job, a service, a craft passed down through texts and tradition. The dream interpreter may seem strange to us, but he represents a timeless human desire, the need to find meaning in the mysterious landscapes of sleep. At night, when the desert cooled and the stars filled the sky, Egyptians laid down on mats, closed their eyes, and drifted into the unknown. Their minds conjured images, some beautiful, some frightening, some confusing. In the morning, they carried these images like burdens or gifts, seeking someone who could explain them. And there sat the interpreter, waiting, his mind trained to connect the visions of night with the truths of day. In his words, dreams became less frightening, more meaningful, woven into the order of life. His was a profession that gave shape to the unseen, a guide through the shadows of the subconscious, long before such words existed. So among the strangest jobs of ancient Egypt, the dream interpreter stands as one of the most intriguing. Neither purely priest nor purely magician, he was a mediator between the hidden world of dreams and the practical needs of life. His work reminds us that the Egyptians saw no boundary between the natural and the supernatural, between waking and sleeping. All of life was filled with messages from the gods, and dreams were simply another way to listen. In this way, the dream interpreter carried the whispers of the night into the daylight, giving voice to the silent language of the soul. We have wandered tonight through the strange and fascinating professions of ancient Egypt. From mourners who cried on command, to keepers of sacred animals, to those who brewed beer for the dead or charmed serpents. In the desert, we have seen how work in this ancient land stretched far beyond what we might imagine. These jobs, so unusual to us, were deeply meaningful to the Egyptians, woven into their beliefs, their rituals, and their daily survival. Every strange role had its place, from the humblest dung collector to the dream interpreter who gave voice to visions of the night. Together, they remind us that life along the Nile was as complex and human as our own, filled with devotion, fear, necessity, and imagination. As you drift now into your own sleep, perhaps you can imagine the Nile flowing quietly under the stars, its waters carrying secrets from one shore to another. The sounds of the ancient world fade into silence, leaving only stillness. If dreams come to you, they too may carry their own symbols, their own quiet meanings, just as they did for the people of Egypt thousands of years ago. Let them wash over you gently, without fear, as you rest. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so you can join me again on another night. It helps others find this calm space of history told for rest. And if you feel like sharing, leave a comment about what topics you'd like to explore next, or when you usually listen, whether at night before sleep, in the early hours of the morning, or in the quiet of the afternoon. Thank you for joining me on this long walk through the strangest jobs of ancient Egypt. May the stories stay with you like a soft dream, and may you rest peacefully tonight, carried by the timeless flow of history.